Hello, everybody, and welcome to the WhatCulture Horror Podcast, hosted by me, Ash Millman, and joined by she, Kirsten Ria.
Hello.
And also by he, Josh Brown.
Hello.
Hello and welcome, guys. I hope you're doing well today because we're going to be talking about blockbuster horror movies, which feels like a bit of a weird one considering the whole world climate and that we haven't really been able to go out and see many blockbuster horror movies this year. But all the same, I feel like that opens up an interesting tangential point as to what blockbuster horror does and if we really need it, especially with so many indies coming on the scene and how the whole horror landscape looks at the moment. I just think it's an interesting blockbuster versus indie sort of situation. Excuse my voice for a moment there. But yes, I'm just going to open up you guys straight away and say, what do you think of blockbuster horror? When I say blockbuster horror, do you go, yes, I love that stuff, inject it in my veins? Or do you go, oh my God, no, formulaic Hollywood nonsense, I don't want anything to do with it? Do you hear it and go, oh yes, please, or no, thank you, stay away?
I think it depends on the decade, Ash. You know, if you talk to me about 2010s blockbuster horror, I have an aversion to it because I feel like it got very homogenized, very kind of watered down in a way, and I didn't like many of the movies that came out in that era. But I think blockbuster horror certainly has a place, and there are so many kind of big blockbuster horror movies that I really like, and especially over the past few years, I feel like we've seen studios kind of embrace more wackier ideas, I suppose, harder ideas. They finally re-embrace the R rating, which is good. We get more gore, we get more adult themes. We don't get these kind of, horror movies for kids. And that sounds really kind of, bad and kind of like I'm speaking down, but I feel like, in their pursuit to get all the money in the world, we had these kind of horror adjacent things where there was more emphasis placed on suggestion, which can be good, but when everything's doing that and you're seeing the same tropes repeated over and over again, it can get bad. But there's nothing I like more than seeing like a really interesting horror director get a load of money and a lot of studio backing and a lot of marketing to like just go nuts and create something really big and really grand and really strange and really interesting. So I think when it's done well, which admittedly can be quite rare, there's like a big place for it, at least for me, in my heart.
That's very fair. How about you, Kirsten? How do you feel about the blockbuster horror?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a particular feeling towards it, but I do agree with Josh that I think a lot of them is like about the money and it has to be done well. I think that when it comes to like sequels and prequels and all this sort of stuff, I think that's when it starts to go downhill almost. Like, there has been some blockbuster horrors that have come out of nowhere and you thought, wow, yeah, that was really good. But then it's like, oh, well, let's cash in and make another one and another one and another one. It's like, where does it stop? Like, there's nothing wrong with just having a great horror movie and just leaving it there. And I think that money comes into it a lot when, like, you think of blockbuster movies, is just how much money they throw at it. And sometimes it's just not necessary when you compare them to how good these small little indie movies can be. Like, they have little to no money to spend on it, and yet they can create these fantastic horror movies. They can create perfect tension and suspense, and sometimes the less you see them, the scarier it is. And I think that's my only aversion to blockbuster horror movies, is that when you're seeing the trailers and stuff, a lot of time it's like, well, let's chuck in all the good stuff, or let's chuck in all the monsters. And then sometimes when you go and sit there and watch it in the cinema, it's like, it's too much. There's too much CGI. It's like, oh, look how much money we have. Let's do all of this and explosions and monsters and all this stuff. And just sometimes it's like, that's not what makes it good. That's not what makes it, enjoyable. It's not what makes it scary. And that's the only sort of thing that I have against them, is that they can be really good, but they are more likely to just have a lot of money thrown at them and actually not that they're not going to be good, but just not scary. And I think a horror movie, they have to induce some fear, because is it then even a horror anymore? Or is it, like Josh said, a horror movie for kids? Or is it more like borderline thriller? Like, it's just, I just think it's just money on the mind with a lot of these blockbusters, and I just don't think it's necessary.
I think the PG-13 horror movie for kids, where it's like the blockbuster light sort of thing, that is a scourge. But if it's still doing something interesting and fun, I'm all for it. I like blockbuster horrors. I like that they kind of open people up to the genre that might not be interested in seeing the smaller things, and maybe they get interested in it that way. I think it's a good little opener for people to go into horror, and for younger kids to enjoy all of the joys of cinema and then go, actually, maybe I'd like a bit more, something a bit scarier, and go and search out other films and that sort of thing. But but that there's no denying that it does throw up a whole raft of problems in the process, with having formulaic sort of plot lines, having issues with, again, just money being thrown at them, as you said, Kirsten. It's just, you have to kind of know that there's heart behind them rather than someone with a big fat checkbook. But with that in mind then, since we've kind of looked at Blockbuster there, what would you say about indies? And what would you kind of define as an independent movie compared to the Blockbuster, since we're going to look at the two? Because the whole definition of indie, I find so hard to pin down. It's almost impossible. It shifts every year.
I feel like I've been plagued by this question like my entire life, Ash, all the way through school and university, and now in this job, you know, whether it's games, whether it's movies, whether it's horror movies, whether it's something else, it's so difficult to define, because you could go down like the kind of, you know, the more straightforward kind of answer, which is if you don't have a big studio backing, if a studio isn't funding your project, if you're independently funding it from a bunch of different sources and making it yourself, then that is an independent movie. But you can't ignore the fact that there's very much like an independent aesthetic that the likes of A24, like they lean on, you know what I mean? You have studio movies mimicking the aesthetic of a DIY indie film to kind of attract that audience. So it's a kind of two-pronged attack. For me, I kind of like define it by anything with a real low budget that's kind of like creator-led, that ideally doesn't have any major studio influence until it comes to the distribution, because, you know, something might get bought at a film festival by Universal Pictures and then get distributed. And I would say that still classes as indie because the production was done independently, you know what I mean? But it's murky waters all around. And I feel like everyone's going to have a slightly different interpretation of what specifies what kind of movie and whether or not the lines can be blurred or whatever. But I do think it comes down to, you know, money, and aesthetics, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, you know, just having, you know, lesser known actors, maybe like B-list or C-list, or maybe even completely unknown actors, is, I think, a dead giveaway. And it's not something that I think, you know, is necessary. I have seen some indie films where I'm like, oh, I know who that is. Like, I'm quite fond of that actor, but then he or she might be the only one that I recognize, and they've clearly, that was where a lot of the budget was spent. But some of them are completely unknown, and that's what I really enjoy, is seeing these, you know, lesser known studios and lesser known actors and companies create something that ends up completely blowing up and getting such good recognition, getting the recognition that it deserves, because they're just so good. And like Josh said, like the actual aesthetic of indie films, like you can just tell that the budget may not be there, but that doesn't mean it's any less good. It doesn't mean it's any less effective. And they get more creative, which is what I really enjoy about indie films, is there's not only a complete abundance of them, there's just so many that you can pick from, but they get really creative with the stories and effects and the sound effects and tension and music. And a lot of blockbuster movies just don't really do that anymore, because they just kind of take the cheap way out of just putting a jump scare in or having a loud sound. And a lot of indie films don't do that. They really focus on the story and the characters and what they can kind of sneak in almost, and like you said, Ash, the actual heart behind it, you can really feel the passion behind the project, and that's what I think you can really tell the difference between indies and blockbusters.
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of like budget wise, I'd say less than 10 million, I think is what we kind of agreed on when I was like, guys, what would you say before the podcast? I think less than 10 million kind of marks it out as something which is ridiculous when you think about it. $10 million like is so much money, but like, oh yeah, it's a little independent release if it's less than that. So yeah, there's all sorts that come under that banner, but I think that's a really fair way that you guys have devised up Blockbuster and indie. And now I've got to ask you what your favorite kind of blockbusters are, and if you would defend those and kind of say, yes, they need their place in the system, or we'll move on to whether like indies and stuff are the backbone of it, which I think will be a bit more interesting as well. But if we start off with our favorite blockbusters and then move on to the indie stuff, what would you say are the ones that people should be watching, that are the good versions of blockbusters, that are the ones that stand up for the Hollywood system, that, you know, make a difference to the whole thing?
All right, I'm going to jump in with like a bit of a paradox because I actually don't love this movie. In fact, there's a lot of it that I don't like. But Del Toro's Crimson Peak, which came out, I think it was like 2015, 16, maybe even earlier, something like that, in the 2010s anyway. It's this like grand gothic romance drama with like deep horror influences. It's not a straight horror movie, but the fact that that thing got made like at all is still baffles me because it's such a singular kind of vision. I know it's like you give Del Toro all this money and he makes something so great that rarely ever finds an audience, which sucks. And to be honest, there's a lot when it comes to like the scripting of that film that I don't fully get on board with, but I just love the idea of, you know, Hollywood giving, you know, interesting filmmakers money, allowing them to make these, you know, grand, opulent horror movies that, you know, are so indebted to the genre and are so passionate about the genre that their kind of charm and personality is so infectious, and you can feel it in every single frame of that film. Because, you know, when we've been talking now, we've been talking about, you know, blockbuster horror movies being these kind of soulless products. And I don't think that's always the case. Yes, they are rushed around for profit. Yes, they are kind of like, you know, incredibly market focused, and they go through test audiences to get the broadest appeal possible. But for me, there's something even comforting in that system. There was something comforting in knowing that there was going to be a Paranormal Activity every single year, that there was going to be a Saw every single year to look forward to, because even though that familiarity doesn't breed originality necessarily, there is something quite comforting. And I don't know whether you necessarily want that from horror, about knowing what you're going to get in some cases. If you already like something, you're going to like the next Saw, or at least going to be interested in the next Saw. I don't think that produces quality movies, but as a horror fan, I think it cultivates a endearing culture of wanting to go back and, you know, interact with these franchises, go to the movies, go to see the next Saw, like you said, Ash, with friends who might not really be interested in horror, but then you can have that shared experience. So I've completely gone off what I was saying about Crimson Peak, but I think there are kind of like two different ways that I can really enjoy blockbuster horror. It's the Crimson Peak way, where you get a really fascinating creative force with a load of money and a load of backing, doing something that might totally bomb, but will have something interesting to it, will have a flair of passion to it. Or you can put something good on the conveyor belt and have that kind of junk food relationship with it, where you're going back and you're enjoying stuff and you're enjoying sequels, and you know what you're going to get. You know it's probably not going to be as good as the first time, but there's still something reliable about it, and they're still getting, you know, competent filmmakers to make those movies, and it's not like they're bad, they're just the serviceable junk food, like I said. And I love junk food. I'm surrounded by Pringles boxes right now that you can't see outside a frame.
It's interesting that you bring up like Saw and Paranormal Activity as kind of the blockbusters that you want to go back to and see all the time, since they started off as like indie franchises and kind of were given the blockbuster washover. Which I think is another interesting way of looking at blockbusters, as kind of giving this chance, again with Crimson Peak and Guillermo del Toro and all that sort of thing as well, giving this chance to people who have proven themselves in like the lower rungs of indie filmmaking and have scrapped it out and gone, oh, we can make something really, really successful on a really tiny budget. Like I think Paranormal Activity was $15,000 and
something mad, yeah.
Saw was just like a tiny clip that they sent off going, please let us make our film, and they got like 1.2 million, I think, or something around that. I had a little look beforehand. And that they've managed to kind of make massive franchises off what are effectively indie offerings, I think offers an interesting dichotomy between the blockbuster and kind of it as a reward system for indie filmmaking as well, which I would like it to be. Definitely in an ideal world, that's what I want it to be. But then you get the whole churned out money makers on the side as well.
Well, I think that's it. I think that's why the first few are always the best, because they're the ones with that independent spirit, and then they do get picked up and they do get kind of the soul, maybe not entirely taken out, but kind of chopped up a little bit and like given to the dogs or something, you know what I mean? But like for me, that does sort of take away some of the appeal, but there is still a kind of charm to that. There's still, I don't know, maybe it's just because we're like creatures of habit, and we like to know sometimes what we're getting into, what we like. We don't like change all that much. So to have these things to look forward to know that, you know, there's always going to be a new Saw, even when they say it's going to end with Saw 3D, there's going to be Jigsaw, there's going to be something else. There's always going to be a new Scream. There's always going to be a Friday the 13th. And if that's like sort of reinvented in an interesting way or continued in an interesting way until inevitably, because I feel like with all the franchises I've even mentioned there, they all run it into the ground eventually. But before that point, there's fun to be had, I'd say.
Definitely. Kirsten, what would you say your favourite like blockbusters are? Are they ones that have come out of original conception, or are they kind of the reward system?
I don't think so. So my pick for a blockbuster has to be like the Conjuring series. And I think that goes into like what Josh said, where I still love the Conjuring series, and I must admit that there is some that aren't as good as others. And obviously they have branched off into sort of spin-offs and side movies and things, and prequels and sequels and all sorts of stuff. I love them. I will always watch them. And there are some that I'm like, that wasn't good. But the actual Conjuring as a whole, like the actual, there's the Conjuring, then there's Conjuring 2, there's the new Conjuring that's coming out. And the fact that they're all based on true stories by Ed and Lorraine Warren, which were real demonologists, and I love that. I love going into all of that, based on a true story stuff, where you can actually go away and physically read about these stories and watch documentaries about them, because it opens up to just completely different avenues almost. And then like you said, Ash, sort of being able to sort of say to someone like, oh, watch The Conjuring, and then it will lead on to this and this, and you can then expand your horror love to documentaries and other things and other stories. And yeah, it does get a bit cheesy and it does get a little bit drawn out, but like Josh said, I'm a creature of habit. I love The Conjuring. I love the actors that are in it. I love Vera Farmiga. I love Elise, the character Elise. I know I'm thinking of completely wrong movie here. Also, just going to shout out Insidious. I love Elise, by the way. Yeah. That is also another series that you should watch. Yeah, the Conjuring series, Vera Farmiga, like knowing that a lot of the Conjuring movies will always have the same characters and actors in them is just really good to know, because I just think, I don't know if they would be the same if they had different actors playing them or different characters in them. And even though they do different stories, it's always going to be Ed and Lorraine Warren. And that's what I just love about the Conjuring series. And then also having these spin-off series where they have The Nun and Annabelle, which then go off on their own sort of like tangents with spin-offs and sequels and prequels. Some of them are really, really good. And I think that series just has something for everyone. And because they have a big budget, they can shoot in these amazing locations, and they can get really good actors, and they can put these really awesome effects. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of CGI. A lot of them is just like special effects and stuff, which I'm sure costs just as much a lot of the time. But yeah, you can really see it's one of the very few sort of blockbusters, especially at the beginning, that you could really see the passion behind the project. And I love that. And it's just the stories that they have told and the ones that are to come, I'm super excited for. And yeah, I'm here for the long run. Whether they're good or bad, I'm still going to watch them. I'll probably still enjoy them, just maybe not as when I first got involved. And yeah, same with Insidious as well. Brilliant series. I can't remember if that was an indie thing or if it was in the cinemas. I do remember seeing a lot of trailers for it, so I think that was probably a Blockbuster one as well. Also got a really big array of brilliant actors in it. So yeah, they're my two that I will always love. No matter how good or bad they are, I will go to the cinemas and I will watch it and I will be happy about it.
I am loving this like Conjuring spiel, man. Like I back it completely. I feel like both The Conjuring and Insidious, again, as much as they are kind of the original conception that has been given the Blockbuster, push to make them into fantastic things, they're the James Wan reward system, you know what I mean? Like he proved himself with Saw and he's proved his franchise making skills, and now they're like, hey, James, my guy, come make us some films because you know what you're doing. And like anything he directs now is just like, you're going to go watch it. It's going to have that blockbuster Hollywood horror sheen to it, but the James Wan special. And I feel like that he's used these franchises and the industry at large to kind of give smaller indie filmmakers platforms to get their first blockbuster movies. It's like David F. Sandberg, I know, was involved with Annabelle. And Gary Doberman, I think, was his writer for ages, and he got to go at directing, all that sort of thing. Not that they were always great movies, but kind of the people surrounding that got pulled in and could do a bit more with it. I thought it was a really nice touch, a real classy touch.
What I do think keeps some studio horror kind of like back from fulfilling its true potential, though, Ash, is that sometimes I think the reward system is a bit skewed, at least in my opinion, because you get these great directors, like everyone you mentioned there, like James Wan is one of my favorite directors. I think David F. Sandberg is like doing some great stuff and interacting with his audience like so well through his YouTube videos in that. But obviously, it's not just horror fans taking notice. It's not just horror producers taking notice. You know, a lot of these directors kind of prove themselves in horror and then immediately get snapped up by like the superhero machine. Like it's the same in kind of indie dramas and stuff. You know, as soon as someone kind of starts to make waves or get a fandom or kind of deliver something that people really love, you know, you get the major corporate moneymakers at the top, which now is superhero movies. And then James Wan goes on to make Aquaman. You know, David F. Sandberg gets taken on to do Shazam. And it's not like that's a bad thing. You know, I'm not telling them what to do with their careers. That's obviously a huge opportunity. But I feel like there is no real middle ground for those directors continuing to make horror movies with that sense of creative freedom with the same level of budget. It's almost like if you want to take that next step, you have to jump out of horror and go into another genre for better or worse. And like they still obviously, you know, have a foot in horror in a producing capacity. They still make horror movies occasionally, but it's almost like I want Hollywood to have that kind of middle ground back where they're like, look, you've made us this great franchise. We're going to recognize that not by pushing you out or giving you opportunities elsewhere, but by giving you opportunities here to make, you know, whatever you want, you know, carry on this series. We'll give you so much money. Because now I feel like, you know, all of the franchises we mentioned, The Conjuring, Saw, Insidious, whatever, it gets to the point where you get those first few by these directors and then they get acknowledged. And then, like I said, they jump ship. And they continue, and the franchise is still big, but then they bring in kind of the usher new people in, which is always a great idea because you get writers going to be directors, second unit directors being the main director on the project. But I feel like sometimes it's mostly just to continue the franchise rather than because they've got anything new to bring to the table, if that makes sense.
That is interesting. I think there's absolutely an Insidious side to Blockbuster. We're painting it with a very rosy glow here, being like, oh well, here's all the good things about it. Because I think we'll get on to kind of the point of it in a bit, but that they do offer out the opportunities and have all this sort of thing, I feel like keeps some sort of indie spirit of horror alive because it's still an experimental testing ground. And whilst, yes, a lot of it is playing to formula and playing to the Hollywood and Blockbuster tropes, if you look at something like that David F. Sandberg did with Annabelle Creation, he just tried out every different type of scare that he could all the way out throughout the film. There wasn't like a set one that he stuck to. And I think having that opportunity to try big and fail is definitely, it's interesting, and it's good that it still exists in filmmaking and that people are getting an opportunity to be creative. You know, there's constraints, but to be a bit creative and have all these different options is good. But then you've got to ask where, like you say, Josh, like where the lines are drawn with creativity, where the formulas come into place, where maybe if they were just allowed to do their own ideas and have their own thing, you'd get a much better film that would then benefit the audience. Because we're talking about it from a very good point for directors and writers and people in the Hollywood system. But from audience perspective, even when they are having these experimental blockbuster films, which again, I say experimental for Blockbuster because horror is an experimental genre, but Blockbuster is not at all. It definitely has its set ways of doing things. But that they have like this tiny bit of wiggle room means that they're more often to just not use it properly, and then audiences get bad movies because people think they're doing something new, but they're following a formula with one added twist or one crazy thing that doesn't quite fit right. So from that point, I'm kind of going to jump into, do you think we still need blockbuster horror? Now, this is the opportunity to just hype up indies all you want in the indie filmmaking system, because the question here is kind of, does it serve a purpose to an audience, to directors and writers and that sort of thing? Does it serve a true purpose, or is it just a money-making machine at this point? We've got streaming services coming in, we've got Netflix and Shudder putting out great films, we've got people doing inventive things, like even in lockdown, people putting out inventive movies like Host, like working from home and just making incredible films. Do we need the blockbuster system anymore? Has like this period, this year kind of proven that we do not need blockbuster and that it's not serving the purposes that we all believed it to over the years? Please excuse my, I've got a sore throat. Please excuse my voice. But yeah, do you think it's necessary? A necessary evil maybe?
I don't know. I feel like every single time we talk about like this dichotomy between indie and blockbuster, you know, all of like the major examples of big successes, like they don't really have anything on like the major indie successes. Because if you can strike while the iron's hot with a great innovative indie movie, you know, like Host, like The Blair Witch Project, like Unfriended, anything that does something different, anything that really captures the audience's attention, they're still going to come. It's still going to make so much money. Like the profits on something like Paranormal Activity or The Blair Witch, like I said, or Get Out or something like that, like they're huge. You don't really lose anything by not having those studio movies. It's not like, and I know I keep comparing it to superhero movies, but if you've got a marquee superhero movie, you want to get in that game, you want to make a lot of money. You're going to need like a big budget. You're going to need some stars. You're going to need some great writers. You're going to need some directors. You're looking at like what, $100 million kind of minimum just to enter the game to get a chance of taking on the Avengers or taking on Aquaman or taking on Batman or Superman or something. But with horror, I don't think that's necessary at all. You know what I mean? Yes, you can pump in $50 million into a project and get a return of 500 million, 300 million, something like that. But you can also put in 1 million, 2 million, 4.5 million in the case of Get Out and make the same amount of money. And I think that's kind of present in the way that a lot of blockbuster filmmaking over the past few years, especially, has, like I said at the beginning, started to mimic that, indie aesthetic, tried to scale down its production, tried to go back to what makes those indie movies so appealing in the first place, and kind of place those limitations on to get the same reward. You know what I mean? I don't feel like audiences necessarily discriminate between a blockbuster and an indie. They don't not go to see something because they know it doesn't have a load of money behind it or because they don't recognize anyone in the cast. If anything, for horror, that's like a plus. That's like a reason to see something. So I feel like, getting rid of blockbusters entirely, it's not what I want. But if it's in terms of kind of like creativity or financial success, I'm not sure whether, it's needed to sustain horror as a genre, because we've seen it time and time again that indie horror can make massive amounts of money, whether or not it has a huge backing behind it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I think, like Josh said, I don't know if it's something that we necessarily need to get rid of, but I think that being in this pandemic has just proven ultimately how little you need to make a brilliant horror movie. And, thinking about it, I don't know if I've ever come out of a cinema and been like truly terrified after seeing a blockbuster movie. I've come out and been like, oh, I enjoyed that. Like, I really loved that. But every horror movie that has ever really scared me has been an indie horror film. And I think it's because they are just so unique and creative, and they do these twists on things that blockbusters just don't really tend to do. They sort of kind of take things that have already been done and they either remake them or they just kind of retell the same story, but just chuck way more money at it. And yeah, they are enjoyable and they are good, but I just, Paranormal Activity, Blair Witch, The Host, is, Unfriended, they're all films that I was like, while watching them was genuinely terrified watching them. It was, they really scared me. The Host is probably one of the only films recently that I watched that actually made me scream out loud because it jump scared me so hard. And just, I think blockbuster films just don't have that same effect. And, like Josh was saying, money doesn't have to be a factor. You can spend very little on a movie and still make just as much at the box office as a blockbuster movie. And we have seen that with Host and with things like Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity, who then go on. And the thing is, you can really see the difference as well when you watch the first Paranormal Activity and then you watch the ones that have then been picked up and had more money thrown at them. They decrease in scares, they decrease in quality, and it's amazing to watch that happen. So I don't know if blockbuster necessarily needs to disappear. I think it's always going to be there, especially with horror. But I can definitely see people going more the indie route. I feel like indie horror is such a popular thing, and it's such a, not an easy thing to do, but it's easy when it comes to thinking of a plot, I guess, because indie horrors can literally be about anything. They could take like a mason jar and turn it into like some sort of evil mason jar, and it could be terrifying because they're just, there's always going to be someone out there that's going to have a brilliant idea that's just going to do so well, and they're going to come out of nowhere. But then it's just, when does that get picked up, or when does that then go from being an indie sort of series to, it's now becoming like a blockbuster franchise. It's difficult, but I think I will always go more the indie route. I will always be more terrified and more enjoyed by indie horror.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that you're going to get the creative good stuff with indie horror when someone's unrestrained by anything and it's just their horrible horror vision put to screen. That is absolutely always going to win out. And like, I asked about the necessity of horror more because of, again, with like streaming services and stuff, the indie titles are getting their wider mainstream audience with stuff like Host, with stuff like there's millions of movies that have all dropped out of my head as soon as I'm about to say any of them. But if you go on Shudder and see any of the top ones that they're promoting, like when The Beach House came out, I saw that everywhere online. That was great, having that as like this social media wave that kind of erases the need for Blockbuster. And as much as it's a great tool for people to, you know, get widespread acclaim and be able to have access to massive budgets for their visions, a la Crimson Peak, but when that does happen, it's incredible. It does try and put horror in a box that I don't think it fits in, and it's good for drawing people in and saying, oh, this is the surface level of horror, have a little swim deeper into what we've got to offer you. But for the most part, it is very much, it can be off-putting with how many blockbuster horrors there are and how many that follow the same formula to try and get a mass market audience and make money off it. That can be off-putting, so maybe it's shooting itself in the foot at the same time. I've kind of got a list of all the ones that are like the big blockbusters that have made the most money over the years, as in the highest grossing movies. What do you guys think is the top for both? I've got without and with inflation, so.
I'm
Paranormal
almost certain.
Did very well, didn't it? As highest grossing.
It's not on either of my lists.
I swear
probably,
that was like one of the highest grossing films. Was it Paranormal?
I think comparative to its budget, it was.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I'm thinking of.
I'm going to say it's going to be up there. That made so much money. That made like superhero level money. And I think adjusted for inflation, The Exorcist, maybe.
Well, it is the top of like the recent ones, because we had all those like articles about it being the highest rating R movie, highest grossing R-rated movie ever, and in the Exorcist comes second in the adjusted for inflation. The first spot. Any more guesses?
The Thing.
No, Thing not on there.
Damn.
I don't know.
Okay. Last one. I'm gonna put you out of misery. Of course, it is Jaws.
Of course, yeah.
Jaws is the OG blockbuster. It is the first blockbuster of its kind. It saw in at the era of blockbusters from the 70s to the 80s, and the Spielberg generation. This is where it all started, and so it has earned the most money, which is interesting and great that a film like Jaws has done that. You know what I mean? That has kind of ushered it in, and that it is horror that incepted the blockbuster trend, that people saw horror movies and went, oh, okay, we can make lots of money off that. Right from 1975, and I think that trend continued with like your Nightmare on Elm Street, your Friday the 13th, your Sleepaway Camp, your Halloween. Like they're all small movies that then blew up into blockbuster films from the way that they were marketed and approached in this wild blockbuster period. But yeah, there's 20, like it's almost 20 different films comparing the two. The Sixth Sense is up there, of course, because it is going to be on this is the recent one. And then it goes War of the Worlds, I Am Legend, World War Z, The Meg, which I don't think counts as a horror movie, but it's on there. Godzilla, 2014 as well, again.
Wow.
Good old Godzilla. It Chapter 2, then Jaws, then The Exorcist. And then in adjusted for inflation, Jaws, The Exorcist, Ghostbusters, The Sixth Sense, yes, crossover, Sixth Sense again, Gremlins, It, Jaws 2, The Amityville Horror, Alien, and Scary Movie is on the adjusted for inflation one. And everybody really likes Scary Movie, apparently.
Because, Scary Movie is that classic horror movie, Scary Movie.
Yeah. But it's interesting to see what people have gone for here, as in like what has earned the most money, what has grossed the most, what people have enjoyed the most, because these are all quite high-rated films as well. There's not really like big flop on there, I don't think. There's some people who are a bit like, it's not my thing, but they've all done incredibly well critically as well. I think that kind of proves the room that blockbusters can have, but in 2018 with The Meg is probably the most recent one. So I think there's definitely room for indies to kind of pull back the ground a bit here.
Yeah, I think that list is interesting because, I mean, all of those movies, with maybe the exception of The Meg, you can class as horror films, but they have much broader appeal. They have a lot of different genres in there, a lot of like comedic elements, in the case of It or The Meg, I guess, and that's not a bad thing by all means, but it's certainly playing for, like the biggest possible audience. They are kind of movies you can take your friends to. They're not going to be like, I don't want to sound like some dude gatekeeping horror, but they're not like they're not like hardcore movies, like edgy,
they're inoffensive.
They're like horror for people that don't like horror,
which is like totally fine. And like some of the movies on there, like I really love. Like I saw it in the cinema twice with my friends, and it was such a great crowd pleasing thing. But I think it is interesting that a lot of those films that have made the most money do have kind of that genre fluidity to them, do have that kind of wider appeal in terms of, you know, what its content is about, kind of like how much it broaches horror, how many comedic elements are there, what the scary thing is in the background. Is it a big shark? Is it this clown that people can, like, you know, dress up as? Is it the Meg? Is it the titular Meg? But like, I don't know, because there were also, you know, there's like The Exorcist now, there's The Sixth Sense, there's some really kind of innovative things alongside that. So I do think that both proves and maybe discredits our point in a way.
I think Sixth Sense is a surprising one, because I wouldn't personally even put that as a horror movie. That always seemed to me as like more of a thriller, but maybe that's just, I mean, it's scary, don't get me wrong, it's scary because of obviously what happens in the movie, and there is really scary elements, but just, I don't know, just to me that's not one that pops up as, oh yeah, that's a horror movie. So yeah, I guess it depends on the person.
I am a fan. I'm a fan of all these movies, I think. I like that there's a mix of everything with the scary, like The Exorcist and It. And It is incredible and does everything right. But I think, like, across both lists, they're all things that kind of did something a little bit new at the time, or at least did something incredibly well that, you know, that nailed a formula that you wanted. Jaws, again, was new. That was the blockbuster inception. That was, like, the suspense. Oh, my God, there's a shark in the water, playing on that. The Exorcist is the freaking Exorcist. Like, of course that's going to be up there. It, I feel like people had seen the Tim Curry version and didn't quite know how serious Stephen King horror could get. I know there's loads of incredible adaptations in The Mist and that sort of thing, but I feel like It was kind of the inception point of, oh yes, we all love Stephen King again, which just warms my black heart. That was kind of like the oh yes, Stephen King horror is back and bad, brother. War of the Worlds, again, adapting a great story well. Godzilla being on here freaks me out a bit, but I think that's more just because people wanted the classic story brought back to life in a way that was accessible to them. And I think that's kind of the end point of blockbusters, is they're accessible. They are accessible. They serve a purpose in people can go, enjoy them with their friends, enjoy them on their own, have just a delectable junk food meal. There's plenty of times where I've sat down and gone, you know what, I'd like to watch Countdown. You know what, I would like to watch Fantasy Island. I'm putting that on tonight. And just because I don't want to think, I just want to sit and I want to be bashed with amazing, like, visuals that, you know, you might not get in an indie film, but just completely brainless people that I know what I'm going to get out of. And I think, like, having that, I think Josh, you called it the junk food. It is the junk food platter. Like, it is like, I know this is bad for me. I know this isn't expanding my filmic horizons, but it doesn't have to. And horror doesn't have to at whole. Like, horror just revels in being cheesy and corny. And I do feel like the blockbuster system suits that because of its formulaic nature as well. So there's plenty of for and against, to and from. There's plenty of for and against for blockbuster. But I think the kind of bottom line of, does it serve a purpose? Is it necessary? Do we still need it? I don't think so in the same way. I definitely don't think so in the same way. The highest for inflation, bar It and Scary Movie all being prior to 2000, like 8 out of 10, with Scary Movie only being released in 2000. So technically 9 out of 10 that are very, very, like, in the past, you know what I mean? Lots of years have passed since then. It kind of proves that they're not getting the draw that they used to, and there's not a film system that relies on blockbusters giving them a chance now and getting a big horror movie out there. Indies have always existed, of course. Independent filmmaking has always existed. Horror has always thrived in there. But I feel like now that it's kind of having its rise in popularity again, that it's not it's ever gone away, just that people are noticing it again. I just think indie is having its time, and we don't need, and streaming is good. I just don't think we need the blockbuster quite in the same way. Oh, that was the longest I've spoken now. I'm like, oh, get out all my words. But just to wrap this up, just very quickly, let's throw out some of our favorite kind of independent movies or like smaller budgeted movies, and we'll end on a nice note of go out there and watch these lovely films. So guys, let me know what you think people should be out watching.
People should watch Raw, which is like a coming of age cannibalism-esque thing that is really very good. Steven Soderbergh's Unsane, which isn't perfect, but I like the fact that it was shot entirely on an iPhone 7 and it kind of has this rough and ready DIY-ish feel to it, and the central performance is really good. And finally, there was one more I was going to shout out. I've completely forgotten it now, so I want to go for some classics. Just watch Dawn of the Dead again. Dawn of the Dead's really good. Evil Dead, I don't know. I'm running out of things to say, Ash. There was one more I had written down, but I can't remember, so I'm going to.
You wanted to mention Get Out, but you mentioned Get Out earlier.
I've already mentioned Get Out.
That was on the list. That was on the list as
really,
a champion.
The Battery, and that's my final one. A really great independent zombie movie. That, Raw, and I've already forgotten the other one.
It'll come.
Just go back in the podcast and then it'll be there. I've said it in the past and now it's already gone. So before I embarrass myself some more, Kirsten, what are yours?
So there's a brilliant horror movie called The Invitation. I cannot remember the name of the actor, but I remember that I very much enjoyed him. He was in Devil as well, which is about people getting trapped in an elevator, which is scary enough, but the devil is in there with them, and it is brilliant. So that's actually another probably independent horror movie that you should watch, is Devil. But The Invitation is about a man who gets an invitation to his ex-girlfriend's house, and yes, things aren't as what they seems. It's very culty. So yeah, that's really, really good. And Dark Skies is another one, which I think is an indie movie. It terrified me. I have actually only seen it once. It's like an alien abduction story with children, and yeah, I haven't watched it since because it scared me so much. And then there's obviously like the classics like Wreck, you know, and Quarantine, even, you know, the remake of Wreck. They're both still very good and very terrifying, and just a really scary, good found footage zombie horror movie. Yeah, there's so many. There is so many. There's Autopsy of Jane Doe, but I'll leave that one for you to talk about because
good. Anytime I can mention it.
Horror indie movies I've seen in ages.
Honestly, anytime that comes up, I'm like, hell yes, I love Autopsy of Jane Doe. Whenever I can put it on, like, get it on a thumbnail, give me some Autopsy of Jane Doe. It's such a good movie. And Autopsy of Jane Doe is literally about the autopsy of Jane Doe. Who's Jane Doe, you ask? I don't know. You don't know either. But it's just that's just a great film. It's literally just a dead body on a table for like most of the film, all of the film. It's great. Watch it. Watch Host. I've mentioned it a million times. Watch Host. That is the innovative indie of our time. Watch Headcount as well, which I picked up on Netflix a little while ago. And it's directed and written by Elle Callahan. It's not a perfect movie. It's not a movie that's like incredible, you know what I mean? But I think it shows so much potential and plays so much with a very cool concept that kind of digs into creepypasta lore and what it can offer. It is well worth a watch, and I'm very excited to see what she does next, if this is like her first foray into filmmaking. Also watched the Dyatlov Pass incident last night, which you know what, I probably shouldn't recommend, because that's formulaic indie somehow. It just managed to fall into exactly what you'd expect from a found footage film, but you know, it's got a bit of cheese to it. So if you fancy that as, you know, the old faithful, then that as well. And lastly, The Blackcoat's Daughter, which is an A24 pickup. But it comes back to me when I sleep. I'm like, oh my God, that was so intense and emotional. Blackcoat's Daughter is one of those ones. I don't know, it's one of those ones that I think about often. I didn't think it made as much of an impression on me as it did at the time, but I think about it so much afterwards that it obviously did. So I have to recommend that one as well. But guys, that is the end of the podcast. We've made it all the way through. But just as an end, if you had to tell people, you know, to forever watch blockbuster movies or forever watch indies, which would it be? I think I know the answer.
Indies. It's got to be indies. Too many good ones. Too many good ones. Too many good
indies,
innovations in there. Yeah.
Support local filmmakers. Support your independent filmmakers, which I think is boiled down to this. But we've tried to talk about some good points of Blockbuster as well, because obviously they're there. It's been a system that's been around so long, and films are just great, and horror movies are just great. So yeah, that is the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for watching if you've done so on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening if you've done so on Acast, because you can find us on both of those. And please come back again soon for some more lovely horror podcast nonsense. I've been your host, Ash Millman, joined by Kirsten Ria, who you can find on Twitter
at Kirsten Ria with 2 A's.
And I've also been joined by Josh Brown, who you can find on Twitter at
Josh Brown with 2 O's.
And you can find me at Ash Millman with the normal amount of letters, but there is 2 L's in my surname, so I'm going to start saying that from now on. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.